Legend Total War here, and today we're going to be doing the first of hopefully many tier list videos for Total War Warhammer 3, starting with a racial power ranking between the 8 new playable races in Total War Warhammer 3, comparing them to each other, and of course rating them from S tier to D tier. Now there's only 8 races in the game, so it's quite possible that one of them may not end up in the D ranking at all, or the S ranking at all. So let's just see how we go. Anyway, let's start with Cathay, and let's talk about them. So, they're a very balanced faction. They've got a decent economy. The caravan mechanic is a good way to make a decent amount of cash. You can make quite a lot of it, especially later on in the campaign. They do have a lot of enemies. Their armies are pretty good, nothing special. Their heroes are a little bit on the weak side. Their legendary lords are quite strong. I would say that Cathay, despite being a challenging position, really, in many ways, all of the factions in Warhammer 3 do have a challenging position, with a few exceptions. But I'm trying to be a little bit lenient towards starting challenge position, but more looking at how powerful they are and what the tools that they have at their disposal to actually deal with those threats. So in that regard, I'm going to put Cathay at B tier. They're sort of... By B tier, that just means like average. They're exactly where they should be in order to handle their threats. But something that could make them stronger is just more global bonuses. Their tech tree is not overly strong. A lot of the bonuses in their tech tree are actually kind of weak. Maybe we'll do a tech tree tier list later down the track. But I think that with Cathay, their overall balance in their campaign is pretty much on par where they should be. Like, their economy is fine. Their military is fine, but nothing is exceptional and nothing is particularly terrible either. So I think B ranking works for them. Next up, the Demons of Chaos. So these guys are a bit weird. They've got a tough start position. Like I said, I want to be a bit lenient towards start positions. Now, you'd think a faction that has access to the entire demon roster would be the most powerful, but it's not really the case. They don't really have a tech tree. Their tech tree is tied to their demonic glory, which is fine, except a lot of those techs in there just aren't really that good. So they have the abilities of all of the demonic races, but none of the advanced abilities of them. And really, the advanced ability is what makes some of these demonic races super, super strong. So he's good at everything, but has mastered nothing. So in that regard, I'm going to put the Demon of Chaos at C tier, because he himself, the actual Demon Prince, is actually not that good. Even when you fully dedicate him, he's always going to be very vulnerable to missiles. He's not as good of a melee fighter as, say, Scarbrand. He's nowhere near as good at magic as Kairos. He's never going to have as much health as Kugath, and he's never going to be as fast as Nakari. So he isn't able to be the best at anything. And I think in Total War Warhammer 3, or Total War Warhammer in general, being a strong race doesn't mean having a lot of weaknesses. It actually means having one mega strength. And unfortunately for the Demons of Chaos, they just don't really have any mega strength. So I think they need to go one tier lower than Cathay. Now let's move on to Kislev. Now Kislev has one of the most difficult campaigns to play, but that's merely due to how much absolute shit the game will throw at you. However, Kislev is a very strong faction in my opinion. They've got really good heroes in terms of the Patriarch and the Frost Maiden traits. The Frost magic, like Ice magic and Tempest magic, isn't that good, but you don't necessarily need to use them for their magic. It means any magic's better than none. So their magic definitely lets them down. Their economy is pretty good, as long as you try to avoid the supply line bug. But yeah, you're still probably going to struggle for money just because of the sheer number of armies that you need. They've actually got viable doom stacks. I'm going to put Kislev at A tier. Now, that doesn't mean that their campaign is easy, but they just have the tools that they need. Like, if their position was in Cathay to begin with, it would be way easier. I think that Kislev is stronger than Cathay. I think their armies are stronger. I think their legendary lords are better, with the exception of Castalton. In some ways, they're not necessarily better in battle, but they've got better bonuses faction-wide. which is kind of more important. Like, the ability of Cathay to just maintain public order is just really useful. And then let's move on to Ogres. So Ogres, I'm going to say, is also an A-tier faction. Now, their start positions are not difficult at all for both Scrag and Greasus. You could argue that the Ogre Kingdoms are the richest race in the game because of camps. You can basically reduce your upkeep costs significantly by constantly putting your expensive doom stacks, if you want to build doom stacks, which I don't necessarily recommend, into camps. Reducing upkeep costs massively, being able to build a camp instantly as long as you've got the capacity for them, and I believe you can have a maximum capacity of 8 camps, and camps can produce money. They can raid enemy territory, although I don't necessarily recommend that. It pisses them off and you don't really make that much money out of them. They're quite easy to defend their settlements. They don't build walls, which is actually a strength. You wouldn't believe it, but yeah, walls are a detriment in this game. Their territory is hard to invade. They're diplomatically arguably the best race in the game because the demons and the order races don't automatically declare war on you. Now, you probably have to side with one or the other, or neither. You're not going to be able to get alliances with the demons and the forces of order, but at least you have that choice. So I'd say that Ogre Kingdoms are an A-tier strength ranking. Very, very powerful. I think the weakest thing about them is their contracts, but it's not a detriment. Okay, now we're moving on to Slaanesh. I'm going to put Slaanesh at C tier because Slaanesh's mechanics... Like, Slaanesh is pretty strong on the battlefield. Doesn't have any missile units. Their magic... The strongest law of magic is Shadow Magic. The law of Slaanesh isn't very good at all. Their Keeper of Secret... Exalted Keeper of Secrets are amazing, and you can make them super bloody powerful. But I think their overall campaign mechanics are quite weak. The Kiss of Slaanesh is pretty good, so using agent actions to essentially get extra devotees is pretty good, but their ability to vassalize other races, order races, takes absolutely forever, so it's not very powerful, and vassals themselves aren't very good, and there's a problem with Slaanesh in that if you vassalize a race of order faction, so let's just say Kislev, Empire, Cathay, and you have an alliance with any of the other demonic races, because they can see in your territory and therefore see your vassal, they automatically declare war on you because of your vassal. So if you're going to have human vassals, you cannot have allies that are demonic. You just can't do it. So it's either or. So I think that because of that, Slaanesh is a little bit on the weak side. They're strong on the battlefield, but I think their campaign mechanics are quite weak. The Summon Disciple army is really good. I really like that mechanic, but it doesn't compensate them for having such a terrible vassal system. It just doesn't really work very well. Now, Tzeentch. Tzeentch is going to be put up at A tier. You might think, oh, but surely the changing of the ways would put them at S tier. No, unfortunately, it's close. It's close. But the reason they don't get to S tier is because of their casualty replenishment rate. Another thing that Slaanesh actually suffers from, these two here have the lowest replenishment rates out of anyone. They don't have any technologies that increase their replenishment rate. They don't have buildings that increase their replenishment rate. Well, Slaanesh does. Tzeentch doesn't. Only Kairos in the faction is actually able to increase his replenishment rate, and only by 6%. There are no enemy lord defeat traits to increase replenishment rates. The Fey Enchantress isn't on the campaign map yet, and it's a big weakness in the later stages of the campaign when you're trying to get into yellow and red territory, because your replenishment rate will be quite awful. And if you get infected with Nurgle corruption, which reduces your replenishment rate by 5%, you basically need to constantly replace the units in your army. However, Tzeentch is arguably one of the strongest factions, if not the strongest faction on the battlefield. They are so irritating to fight against because of their barrier, but when you're using them, cycling out your damaged barrier units with ones that still have barrier allows you to essentially get a lot more out of your units. All of their units in their roster are essentially viable, really, really strong units, with the exception of I think the Furies and the Screamers. I think they're just a bit on the weak side, but all of the Horrors are good, all of their Knights are good, All the Flamers are good. The Soul Grinder's good. The what's it called? The Lords of Change is good. They're demons, and their lords are very powerful, and their heroes are very good. The changing of the ways is possibly one of the most annoying mechanics to go up against, because halt enemy faction is just so irritating, because you could be on force march and then you get halted, and then even though on the next turn you don't get hit, you get hit on the turn after. You just feel like it's not your fault that you got caught in force march. Their teleport mechanic is a ambush battle that you cannot retreat from, so you have to fight that battle even if it's completely hopeless. It's they're very frustrating to fight, and usually as the AI, you're going to want to try to wipe out them as soon as you can essentially go to war with them, but they're not an S tier faction in this game. Next up is Khorne. Khorne is the S tier faction in this game. As much as I love playing as Tzeentch, Khorne is by far the most powerful, broken race in this game, which actually makes them a lot of fun. Now, it's not necessarily their army roster that makes them strong, but it's their campaign mechanics. Their ability to blow up settlements, spawn new armies, keep moving, replenish an enemy territory, summon units mid-battle. Their tech tree is the best out of anyone. The other ones that might be really good as well is Ogre Kingdoms has a really good tech tree. Kislev's tech tree is okay, but it takes a long time to get the good stuff in there. But Khorne's tech tree is arguably the best, because you can reduce the cost on the Skull Throne, you get mega bonuses in there, and you can increase the amount of summons from the Bloodletters, which is a really powerful way to trick the enemy into thinking you're weaker than you are, because the auto-resolve or the balance of power doesn't really take into consideration that much the summoned units, and so even if the bounce of power is just slightly not in your favor, you can use those summons to really whittle down a weak unit, and you can use small armies against small armies to completely overwhelm them just using the summon abilities. Scarbrand is incredibly powerful, and you could argue that Scarbrand has the easiest time getting through the Realm of Chaos because of his ability to gain extra movement every time he fights a battle. He can get through the Realm of Khorne in one turn if you've lined it up properly. He can go through the Tzeentch portals and then use his Unholy Manifestation to attack himself, reset his movement so he can go through another portal at the same time. So he can get through any of the realms the fastest out of any race. He's got the most amount of campaign movement range. They just rocket through every situation. You can demolish all of your starting enemies by like turn 10. By far the most powerful race in the game. Their economy is a little bit on the weak side in terms of like tax income, but they make the most amount of money through loot. So if you are aggressive enough, you'll actually make tons more money than you're losing just by pounding down on things. And they recolonize settlements that they've lost via settlement raising, just because they're drawn to destruction. As long as you own one region in a province, it only takes a couple of turns for them to just reoccupy a damaged settlement. So they're incredibly powerful. Definitely the strongest race in the game. If you haven't tried out Khorne, highly recommend them. And then we come to the Nurgle. Nurgle is unfortunately the weakest race in the game. I'm going to put it at D tier. So this is the sort of premier defensive race in the game compared to the premier aggressive race in the game. Now the thing is, just because these guys are benefited from being super aggressive doesn't mean that they're bad in defense. They actually have super strong garrisons. They're just not quite as strong as Nurgle's stuff. Now, Nurgle's biggest strength is defending their regions, because the tier 1 towers that they build demolishes anything. It's just such a strong tower, and it can really push the balance of power. As long as you've got a decent amount of holding force, a Nurgle army can defend a settlement against pretty overwhelming odds. You just need to build those damn towers. Now, I'd say that out of any race in the game, Nurgle is pretty much super hard countered by Tzeentch, because Nurgle can't deal with speed, Nurgle can't deal with Tzeentch's barrier, and Nurgle can't deal with the fact that everything in Tzeentch's army causes magic damage, and they have spells that just obliterate Nurgle. So having loads and loads of health and loads of melee defense is almost useless against a ranged magic faction that regenerates barrier really quickly, essentially. And unfortunately, Nurgle just is not a damage dealing faction, they're a total faction. And that just kind of makes them the weakest. Now, they don't have the most difficult campaign because their start position is actually quite comfy. Not as comfy as maybe Slaanesh's or Khorne's, but not as difficult as, say, Tzeentch's, who has to deal with Cathay straight away. Or else you're going to really be in the shit in that campaign. Tzeentch of the demonic factions has the most amount of stuff to deal with, but they've got the tools to deal with it. In terms of economy, Nurgle is alright. He does make a lot of money, but it can be a bit random since as the buildings cycle through, you know, your economy, you might be making 10,000 gold per turn, then the next turn, it might just cycle back down to 5,000, so it can be very unreliable. Their recruiting system is pretty good, you recruit units instantly, so being able to deal with emergencies is alright, as long as you can actually afford the units. You do end up having huge amounts of Nurgling sitting in your pool, and then it comes down to their actual faction mechanic, the plagues. The problem with plagues is that they're okay at boosting your armies in your cities, but they're very bad at dishing out damage to the enemy, especially when it's the AI. When it's the player that's getting the plague, it can be quite devastating. But the problem with the AI is that they don't really rely on replenishment. They rely very heavily on just replacing their armies. So infecting an enemy army with a plague that causes attrition isn't very good because, for one thing, the AI is incredibly resistant to attrition unless playing on lower difficulties. They're resistant to public order problems. So any of the plagues that you could put on them just have really low impact. Like -4 melee attack isn't that big of a deal, especially if you're playing on higher battle difficulties, because they're just compensated for that. So the plagues just aren't really that strong. They're probably the weakest mechanic out of any of them, including the vassal mechanic there, because at least Slaanesh is able to spawn disciple armies, whereas using the infections is only really useful for creating plagues, and the plagues are only really useful for boosting your replenishment rate, which is good, don't get me wrong, because you're going to need it as Nurgle, because you're going to take damage. Boosting your replenishment rate, increasing your physical resistance, which is good against the human races, but not so good against demons because of all the magic attack, and providing pretty minor buffs. So I think that's the rating there. Khorne is the strongest, and Nurgle is the weakest, but it's not by a huge degree, okay? I don't think Nurgle is, like, on par with how Norska and... yeah, pretty much Norska and the old Wood Elves and the old Warriors of Chaos were in Warhammer 2. But somebody's got to be the strongest and somebody's got to be the weakest. Now, this is also no reflection on how fun the factions are, but this is just a power ranking. Anyway, that's the end of this video here. Let me know what you think of this rating based on your gameplay of Total Warhammer 3. Do you agree with this list? Do you disagree with it? Where would you put these factions if you were making this tier list? I will leave a link to this tier list in the description if you want to do it yourself and showcase images. What you can do is post links in the Discord, I suppose, showcasing your tier list if you want to do that. Anyway, that's the end of this one here. Appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.